Picture this. You are 14 years old, standing in the center of a freezing stone chamber. The air is damp, heavy with the smell of tallow candles, and every whisper echoes against the castle walls. The Duchess of Bedford sits nearby, her expression sharp, her gaze unblinking. Before her, women of the court move around you with deliberate precision, carrying out a ritual that will decide the rest of your life. Your body trembles, but not just from the February chills seeping through Rouen Castle. It's the weight of terror pressing down on you. With every passing second, you feel your future hanging by a thread, ready to snap with a single word. For in this moment, your worth is not measured by your mind, your courage, or your bloodline, but by a ritual of shame, an examination designed to judge whether you are fit to wear a crown. You are Blanche of Navarre, betrothed to royalty, and though the throne awaits, it will not accept you until you have passed this test. If they proclaim you untouched, you will be paraded as a treasure, your marriage sealed, your destiny written in gold. But if they declare otherwise, even without proof, your crown vanishes, your reputation shatters, and disgrace follows you to the grave. This is not ceremony. It is trial by humiliation, a performance of power where your body is reduced to evidence, your dignity weighed like coin in the balance. You are alone, exposed, and utterly powerless. And here lies the most chilling truth. You are not the first, nor will you be the last. Across kingdoms and centuries, countless women, queens, princesses, and brides were subjected to the same ordeal. Behind the glittering facades of medieval courts lurked these dark rituals. Virginity tests, designed not for truth but for control, became instruments of dominance, tools to bend women into submission under the eyes of kings, dukes, and empires. But the story does not end in Europe. This cruel ritual, born in castles and palaces, spread far beyond their walls. Versions of these examinations echoed through cultures across the world. Women of color, enslaved women, colonized women, again and again, their bodies were subjected to invasive scrutiny, their humanity stripped in the name of purity, loyalty, or ownership. Blanche's trembling figure in that cold chamber becomes a mirror of a much larger history, from African women inspected before being sold into bondage, to South Asian brides paraded before in-laws, to indigenous women stripped of dignity under colonial rule. The same performance of shame repeats. Different languages, different settings, but always the same cruelty. And what makes it more haunting is that these rituals were rarely about truth. They were about power. They were about proving dominance, controlling futures, and branding certain women as unworthy. They were about drawing invisible lines: who belonged, who was pure, who was valuable, and who would be discarded. Imagine the silence of that chamber in Rouen. Imagine a girl of 14, knowing that her fate rests in the mouths of strangers, that her honor can be rewritten in an instant. Imagine the fear that this ritual would follow her name, her body, and her memory long after she left that cold chamber. Now imagine the countless unnamed women who endured the same terror without titles, without palaces, without history books to remember them. So before we descend deeper into this story, before we uncover the hidden chapters of queens who suffered, the countless women silenced, and the echoes of this practice that still haunt our present, ask yourself, what kind of world builds its power by humiliating its daughters? And more chilling still, why do those echoes still exist? Whispered in new forms, disguised by new systems, but always reminding certain women that their bodies are not their own. This is not just the story of a young queen in a medieval castle. It is the story of survival and suffering repeated across time. It is the story of how purity was weaponized to control women, to shape dynasties, and to enforce racial and social hierarchies that have yet to disappear. And if you think this is only the past, stay with me until the end. Because the truths we uncover today are not just shadows of history. They are warnings for our present. Blanche of Navarre was born into a world of contradictions. The kingdom of Navarre, perched between the rugged mountains of the Pyrenees and the rolling valleys that stretched toward France, was a place of beauty and tension alike. On the surface, it glittered with the trappings of nobility, festivals in sunlit courtyards, processions of knights in shining armor, and the endless prayers of monks who blessed each new season. Yet beneath the gilded pageantry, there simmered unrest. Every alliance was fragile, every marriage a negotiation, and every royal child was less an individual than a thread woven into the fabric of politics. For Blanche, childhood was never truly hers. From the moment she learned to walk, the halls of her family's castle echoed with reminders of who she was meant to be. Servants bowed deeply, not to her as a child, but to the symbol she represented. Tutors whispered of duty, teaching her not simply to read and recite scripture, but to carry herself with the grace of a queen in waiting. Even the games she played were rehearsals for the stage of power. Miniature courts where dolls were arranged like noblemen and women, silent spectators of a future already scripted. Blanche's mother, Queen Joan of Navarre, often reminded her of the delicate balance a woman must keep in a man's world. Beauty was currency, virtue was armor, and obedience was survival. These lessons were not spoken as warnings, but as truths, carved by centuries of women before her, truths that would follow Blanche like shadows no matter where she turned. "The crown is heavy," her mother once told her, while fitting a circlet of gold upon her small head. And for a daughter, it weighs twice as much. At the time, Blanche had not understood. In the years to come, she would understand all too well. Navarre itself was a kingdom trapped between larger powers, forever caught in the ambitions of France, Castile, and Aragon. To keep peace, kings bartered their daughters like coins, exchanging them for treaties, alliances, and temporary safety. Blanche was no exception. By the age of 10, her name was already whispered in negotiations that reached across borders. Her worth was not in her laughter, her innocence, or her dreams, but in what she could secure for her family: a marriage to a powerful French prince, a union that would bind Navarre's fragile independence to the will of a greater crown. Yet, behind the polished veneer of royal betrothals lay the darker truth of what awaited her. A queen, no matter how noble her lineage, was never seen as an equal partner. She was a vessel, a bearer of heirs, a symbol of loyalty, a body that could confirm alliances or shatter them in an instant. And for this reason, her body became a matter of public interest, subject to judgment, surveillance, and intrusion. The virginity tests that awaited Blanche were not whispered about in the open, but she had heard enough fragments in hushed conversations to know what they meant. "The court must be assured," one lady-in-waiting had murmured, "that the bride is untouched, for without that certainty, the marriage is nothing but scandal." For Blanche, these words became ghosts that haunted her footsteps. She could not understand why her dignity, her very sense of self, was tied to something so fragile, something she could neither prove nor control. She saw her brothers ride into battle, their worth measured by courage and steel. She saw noblemen gamble, fortunes, their honor tested in duels. Yet for her, the test would not be of strength or wisdom or leadership. It would be of her body, a test of humiliation disguised as honor. The years between her childhood and adolescence passed in a blur of preparation. Blanche was groomed for her role with endless rehearsals in etiquette and endurance. She learned to walk with measured grace, to speak with a voice that carried but never overstepped, to wear garments that displayed wealth without betraying vanity. Yet beneath each lesson lay a silent threat. If she failed to embody perfection, her value could vanish. Unlike her brothers, who could redeem themselves with valor, she would be remembered only for her failings. And so, at 14, Blanche found herself leaving the familiar hills of Navarre for the foreboding walls of Rouen Castle in Normandy. The journey itself was long and cold, stretching across landscapes that seemed to mirror her own dread. She travelled in a gilded carriage, yet felt no more free than a prisoner in chains. Every village they passed offered cheers, blessings, and flowers, but to Blanche those smiles felt heavy with expectation. The people did not see her as a girl, they saw her as hope, as alliance, as the fragile thread of peace. When she arrived, Rouen Castle loomed like a shadow against the grey sky. Its towers pierced the heavens, its banners rippled with pride. But within its walls lay the chamber where she would be tested. No prayer could shield her, no crown could protect her. The women who would conduct the ritual were strangers, and yet their word would hold more weight than her own life. The Duchess of Bedford, powerful and calculating, would preside, ensuring the test was carried out to the satisfaction of the court. Blanche had always imagined that becoming a queen meant stepping into light, processions, ceremonies, adoration. Yet here, at the threshold of her fate, she found only shadows. The virginity test was not about truth, it was about power, a performance designed to humiliate, to remind her that the throne was not truly hers, but a privilege she could only borrow if she submitted to the judgment of others. What Blanche could not yet know was that this ritual, as cruel and degrading as it was, would echo across centuries and continents. Her humiliation was part of a broader history in which women were reduced to symbols of purity, their futures determined by tests of shame. The chamber in Rouen was not just a room of judgment for one girl. It was a stage on which the oppression of countless women would be rehearsed again and again. For Blanche, this was only the beginning. The days that followed Blanche's arrival at Rouen Castle felt like a slow descent into a silent storm. Each morning began with rituals of preparation. Her ladies-in-waiting draped her in heavy gowns embroidered with gold, combed her hair until it shimmered, and reminded her to carry herself as though the eyes of France were always upon her. But no matter how fine the garments or how polished the manners, Blanche could not shake the weight of the chamber that awaited her. The castle itself seemed to conspire against her. Its stone walls whispered of centuries of intrigue and betrayal. Its cold corridors muffled laughter and replaced it with echoes of boots and hushed voices. Every doorway seemed to open onto another test, another pair of calculating eyes measuring her worth. Servants bowed, nobles scrutinized, and Blanche, though cloaked in jewels, felt more naked than she had ever been in her life. Word of the Virginity test spread through the court like smoke. No one spoke of it openly, yet everyone seemed to know. In the great hall, where nobles gathered for feasts and councils, she could feel the unspoken judgment pressing in around her. Each smile was thin, each glance heavy with curiosity. For them, this was not humiliation, it was entertainment. A spectacle whispered about over wine cups and behind closed doors. To them, Blanche was not a girl trembling at the edge of womanhood. She was a piece of theatre, her dignity sacrificed for their assurance. The Duchess of Bedford, who presided over the preparations, made her presence felt like a blade at Blanche's back. Stern and deliberate, the Duchess offered no comfort, only commands. She reminded Blanche of her duty to her family, her kingdom, and her betrothed. "A queen must be beyond suspicion," she said once, her voice low but sharp. "Without purity, there is no legitimacy. Without legitimacy, there is no crown." These words, repeated like scripture, carved themselves into Blanche's mind until they became indistinguishable from her own thoughts. At night, when the castle grew quiet, Blanche lay awake staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with dread. She thought of her mother's lessons, of the heavy crown that weighed twice as much for daughters. She thought of her sisters, some married off, some lost to illness, each of them vanishing into roles they had never chosen. And she thought of herself, caught between girlhood and royalty, with no escape from the ritual that would decide her future. But as Blanche's fear grew, so too did her awareness of the broader injustice that surrounded her. She began to notice the silences of the women in the castle, the servants who lowered their eyes, the noble women who smiled faintly, but never spoke of their own trials. Blanche realized, with a growing sense of dread, that she was stepping into a cycle that had repeated countless times before. Each queen, each bride, each woman of noble blood had endured some version of this test. Their stories were buried, unspoken, erased beneath the grandeur of weddings and coronations. What made Blanche's plight even heavier was the knowledge that beyond the castle walls, other women suffered far worse. Though she was trapped in ritual and humiliation, she still carried the privilege of her title. She had read of women sold across borders, treated not as brides, but as property. She had heard whispers of slaves inspected like cattle, stripped of their dignity under the same cold gaze that now haunted her. Blanche began to see her own test not as an isolated cruelty, but as part of a pattern of control that reached far beyond her life, binding women across lands and centuries in a shared suffering. The day of the test crept closer, each hour marked by the tightening grip of fate. Blanche moved through the castle like a shadow, her body present but her spirit drifting further from herself. Every step echoed with dread. Every breath carried the weight of inevitability. She began to feel as though she no longer owned her body, that it belonged to the court, to the king, to history itself. And yet, beneath the fear, a quiet ember of defiance flickered. Blanche could not stop the ritual, but she could choose how she endured it. She vowed silently that if she survived, she would carry the memory of this humiliation, not as shame, but as truth. She would not forget. She would not allow the silence that surrounded these rituals to erase her suffering. But vows could not soften the blow of reality. The day came. The chamber was prepared. The Duchess summoned her with a tone that brooked no hesitation. Blanche's heart thundered in her chest as she stepped into the room, the cold air wrapping around her like chains. The faces of the attendants blurred, their movements sharp and deliberate. Time slowed, stretching each moment into an eternity. This was not just a test of purity. It was a test of endurance, a test of obedience, a test of how much a young girl could bear before breaking. And as Blanche stood in that chamber, every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide, to vanish into the stone walls. But there was no escape. There never had been. The test began. The chamber was silent except for the scrape of shoes against the stone floor. Blanche stood in the center, her breath shallow, her heartbeat loud enough to drown the world. Candles flickered along the walls, throwing restless shadows that seemed to mock her trembling form. The Duchess of Bedford sat nearby, her figure cloaked in authority, her expression as cold as the February air. The ritual began not with words, but with gestures. Attendants moved around Blanche, circling her like hawks. Each glance, each note, they scribbled, reminded her that she was not seen as a child, not even as a future queen, only as a body to be measured, a vessel whose worth could be declared or destroyed. It was an ordeal meant to break the spirit as much as to judge the flesh. The silence was intentional, the slowness deliberate. Every moment stretched, every pause magnified, until Blanche felt as if time itself had been turned into a weapon against her. Though the test was cloaked in formality, Blanche understood its true purpose. It was not about truth. It was about submission. The Duchess wanted her to tremble. The court wanted her humiliated. The ritual was designed to remind her that her body, her future, even her crown, belonged not to her, but to others. As the attendants performed their task, Blanche forced herself to stand motionless, though every instinct screamed for her to flee. Her mind drifted away from the chamber, away from the cold, away from the eyes that judged her. She imagined herself back in Navarre, running across the sunlit fields of her childhood, before she knew the weight of duty, before her innocence had been burdened by crowns and treaties. But the memory could not shield her. The present was unrelenting. At last, the ritual ended. A verdict was given, not in shouts, not in ceremony, but in a few words exchanged in hushed tones with the Duchess. Blanche could not hear them, Yet she knew they carried more weight than anything she might ever say in her lifetime. Her future, her reputation, her survival, balanced on their lips. The Duchess stood, her face carved from stone. "She is fit," was all she said. The chamber exhaled, the tension breaking like a rope pulled too tight. But Blanche felt no relief. The humiliation clung to her skin like frost. Though the verdict preserved her path to the throne, it left her hollow. The crown had not been secured by her lineage, her wisdom, or her strength. It had been purchased with her submission to shame. Word of her purity spread through the court as quickly as whispers of her testing had. Nobles smiled at her, now congratulated her with thinly veiled relief, as if her worth had been restored. Yet Blanche knew their approval was not for her. It was for the ritual. The humiliation had succeeded. The system had worked. She had been broken into the mold they required. But deep within her, that ember of defiance glowed brighter. She would not forget. She would carry this wound as truth, as testimony. And as she walked through the corridors of Rouen, Blanche began to notice the silences again. The noblewomen who looked at her with faint, knowing eyes. The servants who bowed but lingered just a moment too long. They had all endured their own rituals, their own humiliations. None spoke of it, but the truth was etched into their silence. What Blanche endured was not isolated. It was part of a larger cycle, an endless pattern of control that stretched across centuries and lands. She began to think of stories she had overheard, of women inspected before marriage in Spain, of brides in the East subjected to public proof of their honor, of enslaved women examined like animals on the docks of foreign ports. The settings changed, but the cruelty remained the same. Her own test, carried out in the chambers of a French castle, mirrored countless others. She realized she was a link in a chain of suffering that bound women across time and across race. Some endured it in silence, some in screams, some in forgotten corners of history, but all bore the same mark of injustice. For Blanche, the humiliation was political theatre. For others, it was survival under slavery, under colonial rule, under systems designed not only to strip women of dignity, but to deny them humanity itself. Blanche's crown had been secured through her ordeal, but for countless women without crowns, the same ordeal left them with chains. This realization grew heavier with each passing day. Blanche could not speak of it aloud, but in her heart, she began to carry the weight of not only her own suffering, but the suffering of those unnamed, unremembered, erased. As weeks turned into months, the memory of the chamber never left her. Even as she was celebrated in feasts, even as bards sang of her beauty and grace, Blanche knew the truth. She had been reduced to flesh and judged. And though the court pretended otherwise, she had seen what lay beneath the grandeur of royalty, a system built on humiliation. This was the rising tide that would carry her toward the climax of her story. For though Blanche had survived the test, the echoes of its cruelty were not silenced. They would follow her into her marriage, into her reign, into the very history that sought to erase the pain of queens and the countless women whose voices had been stolen. And as history moved forward, the pattern would repeat. New names, new lands, new victims, but always the same ritual of power disguised as purity. Blanche of Navarre's ordeal was not simply a moment in a cold stone chamber. It was part of a legacy of shame that continues to stain the story of humanity. Blanche of Navarre passed her test, but survival did not mean freedom. The verdict had secured her place at the side of her betrothed, yet in the court's eyes, she was no longer Blanche, the girl who once wandered Navarre's fields. She was now Blanche the vessel, pure enough for a crown, bound by a ritual of shame that had written itself into her very identity. Every feast she attended, every ceremony she endured, carried the shadow of that chamber. To the nobles, she was a triumph of purity, a symbol of legitimacy. But to herself, she was a survivor of humiliation. The memory clung to her in every whispered compliment, every gaze that lingered a fraction too long. She knew what they were thinking. She has been tested. She has been proven. This unspoken truth became the chain around her neck. Blanche discovered quickly that passing the ritual did not end the scrutiny. It only invited more. Her every movement, her every word, her every glance at her future husband was monitored. If she faltered, if she appeared too bold, too quiet, too unwilling, her worth would be questioned again. The test had not been a single event. It had been an initiation into a lifetime of judgment. Marriage only deepened the wound. The court celebrated her union with pomp and splendor. Banners waving high, trumpets sounding in triumph. Yet beneath, the gold and silk, Blanche felt hollow. The ceremony was a cage dressed as glory, each vow another lock sealing her inside. As she stood beside her husband, her crown newly placed upon her head, she knew the truth. This marriage was not hers. It was Navarre's. It was France's. It was history's. And in private, she felt the echoes of the test return. The crown demanded heirs, and the court waited hungrily for proof of fertility. Blanche understood with chilling clarity that her body was no longer her own. It was property of the dynasty. The same hands that once judged her purity would now measure her worth through childbirth, each child she bore, or failed to bear, adding or subtracting from her value. The humiliation of the virginity test had been a prologue. Now came the true ordeal. A life where every part of her existence was subject to scrutiny, where her body was the battlefield upon which politics played out. This cycle was not hers alone. As Blanche endured her silent suffering, she began to hear more stories. Stories whispered by attendants, by midwives, by travelers at court. Stories of women across kingdoms and across races who faced the same cycle of shame. Queens in Castile subjected to rituals of proof. Brides in distant lands paraded before entire communities, their honor tested publicly. Enslaved women torn from their homes, inspected on the decks of ships as though their humanity did not exist. The realization struck Blanche with unbearable weight. Her suffering was not exceptional. It was part of a global ritual of control. Her chamber in Rouen was only one of thousands, each echoing with the same silence, the same trembling, the same verdicts delivered in whispers that destroyed or preserved lives. What made the truth most unbearable was that the cruelty was systematic. It was not the act of one duchess, one court, or one kingdom. It was a pattern repeated in different languages, under different banners, justified by different laws, but always the same humiliation of women, always the same theft of dignity. Blanche's nights grew darker. Sleep eluded her as visions of other women haunted her mind. She imagined them, an African girl torn from her village, forced onto a ship, her body inspected by foreign men who spoke words she could not understand. A young bride in India paraded before elders, her fate decided by the verdict of purity. An indigenous woman in the New World, stripped of dignity by colonial rulers who claimed ownership not only of her land, but of her body. Blanche felt herself connected to them across oceans and centuries, bound by an invisible thread of suffering. The crown upon her head grew heavier with each passing day. It was not gold she felt pressing into her skull, but the weight of history itself. She was not only living her own humiliation, she was living the humiliation of countless women before and after her. And then came the moment that shattered what little illusion of peace remained. Months into her marriage, whispers began to circulate through the court. The queen had not yet conceived. The nobles, once satisfied by her test of purity, now turned their gaze to her womb. Questions rose like smoke. Was she barren? Was the crown cursed? Had Navarre sent France a flawed bride? The same system that had once humiliated her with the virginity test now prepared to humiliate her again, this time through the absence of an heir. Her worth, once measured by purity, was now measured by fertility. And once again, Blanche realized the cruel truth. She could never win. No matter what she gave, The system would always demand more. The pressure intensified until even her husband's affection grew thin. Blanche was not a partner to him. She was a vessel that had failed to deliver. The court's whispers became daggers, and the Duchess of Bedford, her judge and overseer, began to remind her of her duty in tones sharper than steel. The humiliation Blanche had endured in the chamber now expanded into her daily existence. Every feast, every council, every glance in the corridors was another test, another judgment. She was never free, never beyond suspicion, never truly a queen in her own right. The climax of Blanche's story was not a single moment, but a relentless wave of suffering, building and breaking until she could no longer tell where the test ended and her life began. She lived in a cage of scrutiny, and the walls only closed tighter with time. And in that suffocating darkness, one question began to burn in her mind. If queens could be humiliated so completely, what hope was left for the countless women who bore no crowns at all? The silence of the palace was the cruelest sound Blanche had ever known. At night, when the torches dimmed and the feasting halls emptied, she was left with the echo of whispers that never truly stopped. They haunted her like ghosts. Judgments passed in corridors, smirks exchanged between courtiers, the weight of disappointment thick in the air. She began to understand that humiliation was not a moment in her past. It was a condition of her existence. To be a queen, a woman placed on a pedestal for all to see, was to be stripped of privacy forever. Her every breath was political. Her every gesture was dissected. And when she failed to provide an heir, the same nobles who had once cheered her, wedding now turned her into an object of scorn. Blanche's chambers, once adorned with silks and golden embroidery, became her prison. The Duchess of Bedford visited her with eyes like blades, pressing questions upon her. Why have you not conceived? What is wrong with you? Do you understand what's at stake? The Duchess's words cut deeper than the cold hands of the midwives, who had once tested her purity. This was no longer about honor, it was about survival. If Blanche could not give birth to the future of France, then she had no value. Each month became a new trial. Midwives inspected her again, not for virginity, but for signs of pregnancy. Every cycle that ended in failure only confirmed her deepest fear that she would be cast aside, discarded like so many women before her. Blanche, who had once been hailed as a triumph of Navarre's royal blood, was now whispered about as cursed. The cruelty lay not only in the judgments of others, but in how they forced Blanche to judge herself. She began to see her body not as her own, but as a broken vessel, a flawed instrument that betrayed her with every passing day. She despised the mirror, despised the gowns that wrapped around her waist, despised even the crown that dug into her skull. All of it was a reminder that her worth was conditional, fragile, always in question. And yet, Blanche's tragedy was not isolated. As her body became the battlefield of dynastic politics, she felt again that invisible thread tugging at her, connecting her suffering to countless others. She imagined an enslaved woman standing on the auction block, men examining her teeth, her limbs, her womb, deciding her worth not as a person, but as property. Blanche saw herself in that woman's silence, in the humiliation that became a language unspoken yet universally understood. She imagined the indigenous bride taken by colonizers, her body turned into a symbol of conquest. She imagined young peasant girls forced to prove their chastity before lords who would never be tested themselves. The cruelty of Blanche's world was not limited to castles and crowns. It was a cruelty that spanned continents, colors, and classes. The test of virginity was only one mask worn by the same monster, the belief that women's bodies were not their own. As months turned to years, Blanche's despair reached its breaking point. The crown upon her head felt like a shackle, the palace like a dungeon. She began to withdraw, her laughter fading, her voice softening, her spirit dimming. Court painters captured her likeness with strokes of elegance, but behind the canvas was a woman hollowed by humiliation. Her downfall became complete the day rumors spread of annulment. Whispers filled the palace halls. If Blanche could not conceive, she would be cast aside. A replacement bride would be found. Someone younger, someone more fertile, someone more capable of fulfilling the single duty placed upon a queen. In that moment, Blanche realized the full horror of her fate. She had endured the virginity test. She had endured the silence, the whispers, the shame. She had endured the crushing weight of expectation. And yet none of it mattered. Her survival was never in her hands. She could be discarded just as easily as she had been chosen. This realization shattered something deep within her. For the first time, she saw the system for what it truly was. A machine that consumed women, stripping them of dignity, grinding them down to nothing, and then discarding them when they were no longer useful. It was not personal. It was structural. It was history repeating itself endlessly, fueled by the same belief in ownership over women's lives. Blanche's story, though steeped in royal splendor, was no different from the enslaved girl, the colonized bride, the peasant child. All of them were caught in the same cycle of humiliation, control, and silence. The only difference was the stage upon which their suffering played out. As the climax reached its unbearable peak, Blanche asked herself the question that history would never answer. If queens themselves were not safe from humiliation, what hope existed for any other woman? It was a question that cut across centuries, echoing through the lives of women everywhere. For in Blanche's story, we do not only see a medieval queen, we see the echoes of injustice that persist, the same chains forged anew in different eras, in different lands, in different guises. The test was never about purity. It was always about power. And power, once claimed, never loosened its grip willingly. Blanche of Navarre faded into history not as a triumphant queen, but as a cautionary tale. The palace records speak of her as a name in genealogies, a pawn in dynastic games, a woman weighed and measured, found wanting and quietly erased. She left behind no heirs, no grand victories, no celebrated legacy. Instead, she left silence. The silence of women whose lives were consumed by systems larger than themselves. But in that silence is where her true story lies. It is in the unspeakable humiliation of the virginity test, in the coldness of stone chambers, where her body was judged like cattle. It is in the suffocating expectation to produce an heir, the whispers of annulment, the sharp eyes of those who measured her worth only by fertility. These moments, stripped from official chronicles, reveal not just Blanche's suffering, but the cruelty embedded in the very fabric of her society. And it is here that her story breaks free from the walls of Rouen Castle. For what Blanche endured is not confined to medieval France. It is the same cruelty that enslaved women endured in markets where they were stripped and examined by foreign men. It is the same cruelty that indigenous women endured when their marriages were turned into symbols of conquest. It is the same cruelty that black women endured under colonial regimes, where their wombs were not their own. The examination of Blanche's body was not an isolated ritual. It was part of a vast, unbroken chain of violence stretching across continents and centuries. Blanche's silence is shared by millions whose names we will never know. Her humiliation is echoed in the lives of girls forced to prove their purity, women denied control over their own choices, and those who even now live under systems where their bodies are still debated in courts, churches, and governments. The costumes have changed. The palaces have become parliaments. But the chain remains. And yet, in Blanche's story, there is something more than despair. There is revelation. For when we see her humiliation not as isolated, but as part of a universal pattern, we can no longer accept the systems that demand such sacrifices. History is not simply about queens and kings. It is about the countless lives crushed in silence. To tell Blanche's story is to tell theirs. Her legacy, then, is not in heirs or victories, but in the truth she reveals. That dignity denied to one is dignity denied to all. that no society can call itself civilized while treating women's bodies as bargaining chips, that every humiliation leaves echoes that shape the world we inherit. Picture again that cold chamber in Rouen Castle. Picture a girl of 14, trembling, surrounded by hands that claim authority over her most private self. Now imagine her multiplied by thousands, by millions, across time and place. That is the true story of history. That is the shadow that still lingers. And so, as Blanche's life fades into the pages of chronicles, her suffering demands one last question of us. If queens themselves could not escape humiliation, how many untold lives have been broken beneath the same weight? And what will it take, in our own time, to finally break the chain?